because so many people are kind of weird and funny about wanting to talk about this word. They're really afraid of this word narcissism, the almighty N-bomb. It means that the conversation often stops the minute you bring up that word narcissistic. You know, this video is, it's probably almost better for me to start it with a story and then we'll kind of go into what it's about, which is, I want you to imagine, it's not hard for you to imagine, you are in a narcissistic relationship and you want to talk to someone about it. And you take it to someone who knows both of you. They know you and they know the narcissistic person. And they say to you, oh, I can't hear this. I can't, it's too much for me to hear this about this person. And I can't be there for you. And they go away. I want you to sit with that for a minute and how you felt when that happened. I'm guessing high on that list of how you felt, and maybe weren't even able to put this word to it, is you felt abandoned. And this happens to people all the time in narcissistic relationships, is that they find that when they finally try to talk about the misery of this relationship, that there are people around them who say, oh, it's just too much. It's too hard for me to listen to this. Let's take on this idea of feeling abandoned by the people who just can't take it. So there was a life you had before you knew about and understood narcissism, and there's the life afterwards. Wherever you learned about it, and it's almost like a life split in two. In a way, the life before you understood what narcissism was very difficult. It was full of self-blame, it was full of confusion, but it carried a small luxury. You didn't need to learn and live with the uncomfortable truth of narcissism, how it doesn't change, the harm it can result in, that someone you wanted to have love you, that you loved, was really never going to be able to have a deeply felt, regulated, and sustained and meaningful relationship with you. That is a painful moment and a painful recognition. And once you get it, life may contain more grief where there was once more confusion. So let's go back to this idea of those of you who did figure it out, you understood narcissism, you apply it to your relationship, and you're living the day-to-day pain of these relationships. You also know that one of the greatest assets in healing and in feeling better is when other people validate your experience. They offer empathy. They get it. When you are in a narcissistic relationship, mirroring becomes a thing of the past. So when it does show up, it can feel like a warm blanket around your shoulders on a cold day. That said, many people don't get it. I would actually hazard to say that most people don't get this thing called narcissism. They don't understand how it operates in relationships. Either it hasn't happened to them, or they're narcissistic themselves and they're the problem, or they're enablers who are getting some kind of secondary gain from the narcissistic folks and are invested in not seeing it clearly, or they just want to live in their cozy and naive universe and not have to make the mental shifts to accommodate that this is a thing. That there are folks with these personalities out there, that they cause a lot of anguish and they cause a lot of harm, and that they won't change. There's a lot of people out there who just don't want to know this. So I'll give you an example of this, right? It may be that you're in a narcissistic marriage and you have a parent who says, "Ugh, I don't want to hear about all this awful stuff. You have to be able to work this out." Or a friend who might say about a narcissistic relationship you're in, "Ugh, I don't want to hear about this. It's so dark. It can't be that bad." Or the colleague talking about someone narcissistic you work with and might say, "Oh, come on now, he's full of bark, but there's always a path forward. I can't listen to this stuff." One woman I know who had been married for about 15 years had told me that her marriage to a vulnerable, malignant narcissist obviously was taking a tremendous toll on her, and she had sort of no playbook for this. Her parents had been very happily married, and she had no idea what she was dealing with. Even when there was palpable tension and dismissive and humiliating behavior from her husband in front of her parents, her mother would say banal things such as, "Just love him more. Maybe he's intimidated by you and doesn't know how to be loved. As time went on, and big surprise in this woman's marriage, things did not get better. She was seeing her mother less and less as her husband became more and more controlling and isolating. And she was desperate for someone to talk to and get support from, and she loved her mother. So when she would get little chunks of time with her mother, she'd tell her what was happening in her marriage. And her mother would literally cover her ears and say, "La la la, no, 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 I can't hear these things. Please don't tell me." The daughter felt abandoned by one of her last sources of support. And this happened for no other reason than her mother couldn't tolerate having her sunshiny worldview fractured, and she was willing to let her daughter twist in the wind. Many years ago, I had a similar experience that I've shared on this channel in the past, in which a woman I knew was sharing the horrors of something she was going through, a very malignant narcissistic marriage and very, very expensive, painful, and protracted divorce. The things her husband did were absolutely horrible. And that woman, who was in the terrible marriage, she rarely got out and got to see friends. So she was here out for lunch, and she was telling the assembled group of women the things that were happening, the things that he did. She really didn't have many other places to share it. I was already doing my work in the area of narcissistic abuse, and in conversations I had with her, I was trying to gently nudge her towards radical acceptance and pointing out the uncomfortable truth that it wasn't likely that he would change. And another woman at the table, someone who happened to be very fortunate and have a very happy marriage and plenty of money and a relatively simple and much easier life, said, "Okay, ladies, it's lunch. It's too much. I can't hear this. I don't want to hear things like this." I was absolutely disgusted because in this case, the woman was going through hell. And the unwillingness of this little spoiled lady to hear it because it didn't pair well with her chicken salad and that it would make her uncomfortable was deeply shaming. I never agreed to spend time with that shaming woman again. I have no idea what happened to her. No, it wasn't easy to hear what this woman was sharing about her marriage. It wasn't. But sustained friendship, and certainly being a parent, as in the other story, means you sit with another person's pain. And you don't push it away because you can't handle it or because it doesn't fit in with your worldview. The people who can't handle it, who look away, who can't be there for you, maybe what they're happening is a mix of betrayal blindness, cognitive dissonance, and good old-fashioned immaturity. That they want to keep a cotton candy, glossy worldview of not wanting to believe that someone in their midst was so harmful and trying to make the pieces fit in a way that leaves the world feeling fair and good. It feels simple. I have watched people I care for who have been in narcissistic relationships face this kind of steely rejection in the face of their suffering because culturally it didn't make sense. The obsession with marriage and family overrode their capacity to be there for someone who was suffering. In my book, that is not okay. And culture is often a driver of this. The focus on these constructs, loyalty, family, hierarchy, means that many people around the world are left to endure the manipulations, the confusion of narcissistic abuse alone, and endure the double wound of being invalidated and shamed, not just within their narcissistic relationship, but also by the people around them who are supposed to love them and have their backs and not walk away because you're sharing something with them that they don't love to hear. But ultimately, when someone says, "La la la, I can't hear this, it's too painful," that's a form of abandonment. Nobody wants this to happen to them. And the only reason people would share it with anyone is because they need to share it. They've been gaslighted into oblivion and they're desperate for a reality check. So when people shut their ears and can't allow their precious worldviews to be punctured, that qualifies to me as an abandonment. Sometimes these folks who do this are enablers, but not always. In the case of the mother-daughter, it's not even as though that mother had any particular affinity or that she liked the narcissistic husband. Interestingly, it was just that she didn't want to hear that there was any awfulness in the world. Many people have these stories of family members who would rather watch a family member suffer than to have their worldview sullied. And many of these folks said, the narcissist is the narcissist. They are empty, hollow, shallow people, and with radical acceptance, I got there. But what really stung was to have the people who I know could have done more and been more, to have them turn their backs on me. That was the bruise that they carried. That ended up being what fueled their lack of trust and abandonment fears every bit as much, and in many cases more, than what was actually happening in the narcissistic relationship. Once you understand narcissism, we're like, okay, narcissist is going to narcissist. But when the people you actually think around you are decent people aren't able to be there for you, it really can do a number on you. I know it isn't this simple, but I do sometimes wonder if the world is basically divided into those that are narcissistic or antagonistic, those that are being harmed by these relationships, those who are the enablers, and those who do not want to believe that any of this is a thing because it is icky and it's uncomfortable and it is easier to pretend that it isn't happening. For those of you who are going through the rigors of narcissistic abuse, having the experience of people you care about saying to you, shh, 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 don't talk about this. I can't hear this. That experience may be every bit, if not even a little, maybe even a little more harmful to you than enduring the narcissistic abuse. And when you put those two experiences together, it results in an experience of aloneness and isolation, and it magnifies the self-blame and the anxiety. And it's not okay. I know the people who do this to other people are not watching this video or this channel. But if this has happened to you, yes, it is a thing. If it has happened that when you finally try to share it with someone, they basically abandon you, it is a thing. And it can take the process of healing and make it far, far more difficult and painful. I get this pushback a lot. Some of you may have gotten this pushback and get it from different kinds of people. The idea that you should not use the word narcissism because you do not have the right to diagnose someone. Even though I work in mental health, I can't diagnose someone I haven't met, etc., right? But you're right. We shouldn't be diagnosing people we don't know. We shouldn't be diagnosing our friends. It's not a healthy thing to do with a partner or a family member, and I shouldn't be diagnosing someone I haven't met unless I have a case report. But here's the rub. Narcissism isn't a diagnosis. Actually, the word narcissism is a noun. The word narcissistic is an adjective. These are descriptive terms that capture a pattern characterized by lack of empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, validation seeking, arrogance, sensitivity to criticism, dysregulated emotions, difficulty coping with frustration or stress, rage, and all of this is coding a deep sense of insecurity. Personally, I think it's a really useful adjective. It's one word that gives you a lot of descriptive power. But if we're talking about adjectives, and people have a problem with the adjective narcissism, but let's talk about other adjectives that people use to describe people all the time. They use adjectives sometimes like stubborn, or agreeable, or friendly, or boring, or anxious, or grumpy. Nobody ever accuses you of diagnosing someone if you use one of those words. If I said someone was stubborn, nobody would say to me, well, you shouldn't diagnose them. And yet, those words, stubborn, agreeable, boring, they serve the same function. It's one word that can actually signify multiple patterns. So, where did the confusion come from? It all came from something called narcissistic personality disorder. Narcissistic personality disorder is actually a relatively new player in the diagnostic world. Heinz Kohut first used the term in 1968, and the diagnosis actually didn't show up in the DSM until 1980. This is a disorder that affects maybe 1 to 5% of the population. It depends on the study you're looking at. And it gets tricky. In order to get this diagnosis, not only do you need to get at least 5 out of a list of 9 symptoms, similar to the list I just gave you that described narcissism in general, a person with this personality disorder also has to be evidencing some kind of social or occupational impairment, or what we call a sense of subjective distress. They're just uncomfortable. And that's where all of this gets really tricky. Narcissistic people in general don't have lots of insight into their behavior. So not only do they not notice the problems that they are having that are because of them, they may actually not have any distress due to their narcissism per se. They may be making other people miserable. They may be causing other people distress. But because we actually live in a world that rewards entitlement and arrogance, and because narcissistic individuals are so often financially successful because they're willing to do anything to get ahead, for narcissistic people, their lives often seem just fine to them. In fact, the rare times that we as therapists see people with narcissistic personality disorder in therapy is because something else has gone wrong in their lives. For example, their spouse or partner threatens to leave them. The narcissist gets caught doing something problematic, like, I don't know, having an affair or lying to people. They lose their job or some other source of power or validation for them, or somebody files a lawsuit against them or something like that. Then the narcissistic personality will roll up to therapy in a very victimized way and blame the world for their problems. And it can take the therapist a minute to sort of figure out what's going on and understand the pattern that's in front of them. Lots of people who are narcissistic actually don't have these impairments or this distress. And because of that, they don't get a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. People like Dr. Alan Francis, who is a world-renowned expert on personality disorders. In fact, he's one of the people who wrote the diagnostic criteria for NPD. He's pointed out the dangers in this diagnosis. He sort of suggests that once we diagnose someone, we run the risk of subsuming or putting their behavior under an umbrella of an illness, which in many cases then ends up being used as an excuse. This is an issue and a criticism that has also been raised by other fields, including the domestic violence world. Basically, saying someone has a disorder is like, hey, I have an illness. I can't help that I don't have empathy. It's my illness. And then, in essence, giving someone this diagnosis becomes basically a way where you can medicalize their meanness and medicalize their being a jerk. And they'll use that as an excuse. And there's another issue as well. I was reading an article in the New York Times a few days ago, and I read a very concerning article about an extremely toxic, antagonistic, seemingly narcissistic person by the description. And the writer of the article was actually attempting to rationalize the behavior of the toxic person, because they were trying to say, well, they might have narcissistic personality disorder, so we need to make allowances for that. The struggle then becomes this. If a person with NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, is considered to have a mental illness, then this particular New York Times writer would have argued that, well, a person has to give allowances for that. They do, after all, have an illness, which in essence is just enabling on steroids, since we know that narcissistic personality disorder is actually not amenable to treatment. My vote personally is scrap the diagnosis entirely, recognize that this is an abusive pattern, and it's a very problematic pattern for people who encounter it, provide tools and resources for the people who do encounter these kinds of personality and behavioral patterns. And as for the people, whether you have narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder, get help. Focus on your recovery. Be mindful. But calling it a diagnosis actually doesn't help anyone and can actually result in more enabling and problems. Many times I get the question from a person who wants therapy with me and says, I just need you to tell me, does my husband, does my wife, my mother, my father, my boss, my sister, my brother, my daughter-in-law, my mother-in-law, my brother-in-law, my father-in-law, my friend, my coworker, whoever their person is, does this person have narcissistic personality disorder? First of all, is I don't know. And my second response is, who cares? Look at this person's behaviors. Look at their patterns. If these behaviors are so toxic and problematic, why do you need to know about a diagnosis? You are being mistreated. It's on you to set the boundary or get out of the relationship or go gray rock or keep enabling it if you want. That choice is yours. Don't wait for it to change. That's a sucker bet. And don't wait for someone to diagnose it because it actually doesn't matter. Then there is the even bigger confusion. There are many people out there who still use the word narcissism totally wrong to mean self-love, when in fact it's literally the opposite. It's self-loathing. It's insecurity. It's actually kind of sad because it's a person who lives in a constant sense of threat and fear. They're afraid that their power will go away, or that people will stop liking them, or they will lose validation, or they will be found out. Looking into the mirror and posting selfies, just that one pattern, it's not necessarily narcissistic. And it's important that we are clear about this distinction. Because when you are being manipulated and invalidated and gaslighted, and a person minimizes your pain and your struggle because they think that you're with someone, oh gosh, narcissistic abuse, what's that? But it's a person, the narcissist is just someone who likes to brag and show off their new car. That's not what this is. And that means other people don't recognize that what you're up against, and they gaslight you even more. I'm going to tell you this, I've actually known more than a few clients with narcissistic personality disorder over the course of my career. And it's not always clear the first time I work with them. It can take weeks or months to reliably land on this diagnosis. But the fact is, this pattern of narcissism is a lot more common because so many people are kind of weird and funny about wanting to talk about this word. They're really afraid of this word narcissism, the almighty N-bomb. It means that the conversation often stops the minute you bring up that word narcissistic. Over the years, I have talked to many groups, and over those years, we have come up with lots of synonymous terms for narcissism. I often teach people to use these words instead, especially if they're talking to an audience or to an individual or person they don't know, so the other person doesn't get all worked up about you diagnosing someone. So here's some good substitute words. And you know what I'd love to hear in the comments? If any of you have different words to add to this, please let me know. So here's some words to use instead. Difficult, antagonistic, high conflict, toxic, angry, disagreeable, contemptuous, entitled, full of themselves, or the selfish, egocentric, egotistical thing. But like I said, if you have other words you want to add, drop them in the comments. Now, words that some people use, but I actually don't agree are synonymous with narcissism, include sociopathic, psychopathic, misunderstood, or tyrannical. Now, those things may be potentially true of some people, but there are also words that other people are going to take offense to. It's going to stop your conversation again and may often be inaccurate. To the degree you can, when talking about the difficult person in your life, don't get caught up in finding one word for them. Focus on the patterns. Again, if you have other words to add to that list, and I don't want obscene words, okay? We want words people can take into court or with HR or with family. Again, I want to hear them in the comments. But if you are arguing with somebody, chapter and verse, and you're trying to understand diagnostically, is there a difference between narcissistic personality disorder and narcissism? The word narcissism by itself does not imply a diagnosis. But for a whole host of reasons, lots of people are uncomfortable with it. So I'd like you to learn new ways to talk about it and find your safe spaces where you can use the word narcissist. And listen, if someone's in therapy with me, they can use the word, but I know not everyone wants to hear it. Personally, I think the word narcissist is a good word that gives you a lot of description in one word, as long as you understand it correctly. Sadly, it is often overused, misunderstood, and it can take a difficult conversation about a really difficult issue and make it even more difficult. And that's not what narcissism is about anyhow, it's being difficult. This is very, very, very new territory in mental health. Although there has been a small group of theoreticians and this more obscure literature on narcissism that has always been there, what mental health has not done a good job of is really identifying this pattern and the impact it's having on people's lives. Because I work with clients who are narcissistic, I'm the first one to understand. I, as a clinician, can bring the compassion and whatnot, but then after an hour, I can send them on their way. This is a person in your life. These patterns are harming you. And I don't want you to use the idea that, well, they have a diagnosis, so maybe I just need to put up with this. No. Maybe the real reform has to be that we stop talking about this as a diagnosis. We really see it as a pattern that's not good for the person who has it, a pattern that's not good for the people who are affected by it, and find more meaningful diagnostic ways to talk about the other patterns people with these personalities may go through, but not use it as a way to get out of it. Let's talk about people being shamed for being discerning. The most central tool to protecting yourself from a narcissistic relationship, and yet you're shamed for it. Let's break that down. So, things that survivors will sometimes say to themselves, especially after they've been through it and learned a little bit about narcissism. They may say, I'm being too fussy, or it's not realistic for me to expect so much of other people, or if I keep being this choosy, I'm going to end up alone. Discernment is one of the key tools in managing narcissism in your life. If done correctly, it can be a brilliant tool to keep them at bay, not let them in too far, set boundaries, and cut your losses early. It's a tough tool, especially if you are empathic, because for reasons of things like cognitive dissonance, socialization, a history of trauma bonding, and invalidating relationships, the tendency is to make excuses when you meet a narcissistic person early on, and even, honestly, after you know them for a while. But it's not that simple. What's even worse is that other people may shame you for being discerning. They may tell you that you're being too fussy, that you can't expect so much of people, or that if you keep doing this, you're going to end up being alone. Or they will even get in a dig like, oh, so you're so perfect, huh? So in essence, you get shamed for noticing red flags and wanting to disconnect, set boundaries, or distance. Now, I find that discernment, something I preach, is great in theory, but it can get quite thorny in practice. I myself have had lots of problems with it. I'll meet someone, they'll seem toxic, I'll distance. And then people have said to me everything from, Ramani, you're not a team player, to you have to give people a chance, to even when I don't say one thing, all I do is distance. Oh, Ramani, you think everyone's a narcissist, don't you? Yes, and they say it in that voice. Now that narcissism survival is a primary focus of my work, I've stopped caring what people say and think. But back in the day when those voices mattered to me, I would think to myself, sometimes on a bad day I still do, I'm a horrible person. I'm a witch. Maybe I'm the narcissist for taking this stand of discernment. And this negative messaging was mirrored by the numerous trauma-bonded relationships that I've had. But if you are going to be discerning, sadly, in some ways you've got to sort of tolerate the shaming, which means developing some pretty thick psychological calluses. So when people tell you that you're being fussy or that you're going to die alone, then you have to do some second-level discernment and ask yourself if the people issuing you those criticisms, if they're enablers, and you got to erect some boundaries around them too. There are some tricks to discernment, though. It's really hard to cancel the script inside your head that you are the one being difficult by being discerning. That's the work of slowly addressing trauma-bonded patterns, not confusing empathy with enduring abuse. That's not easy work. Now, when it comes to other people, one place to start is to not tell other people that you're doing this kind of discernment initially. Just bow out, distance, set a boundary, perhaps acknowledge that you're busy or don't have the time. Because when you share red flag detection and discernment with other people, they can be judgy. I think the idea of discernment may make people nervous because they are concerned that they could be flagged as a sort of a red flag person. And my advice to anyone, and the simplest advice, is literally the simplest advice in the world, is don't be an asshole. Like, if everyone remembered that, it'd be a hell of a world. Also, what can be helpful is to look back at some situations when you were discerning, but still were able to know how that person was behaving in various situations. So then you could see that those red flags you detected early, those things that left you feeling uncomfortable, were a thing. In one of my more recent experiences of this in my life, it became apparent that someone I had met very, very quickly was toxic inside of 3 minutes of meeting him. He was absolutely awful. And I was viewed as a not nice person for avoiding him. I never even said anything about him. I just avoided him. I wouldn't work in small groups with him. I wouldn't even want to be seated next to him at dinner. His behavior was always awful. But everyone kept saying that no matter how different we are, we can all work together, kumbaya nonsense. It became a battle of tolerating the idea that I was being viewed as a difficult person, but this person really was. Then that toxic person, after a few years, emboldened by everyone cutting him a wide berth, did a really bad thing. It caused all kinds of problems. It wasn't even that it felt good that I was right, maybe a little bit, but the issue did hurt people, but it really taught me how difficult discernment is. I just had to be resolute and tolerate being unpopular. Whether we do discernment quietly and then shame ourselves, I'm fussy, I'm being uppity, or others shame us, who do you think you are, glass houses, all of that. The best tool, discernment, is one of the most difficult to use. But that doesn't mean you can't use it. Use discernment quietly. Again, reflect on that tiger's cage metaphor I've shared. If you have to test the waters by walking into the cage, you may get shredded up a bit, but then at least you tested the hypothesis, and it kind of confirms that you were right in your instincts. Discernment doesn't mean that you have to turn on your heel and walk away. It doesn't mean that you have to share with others that you think this new person is toxic. It means trusting yourself for a minute, moving slowly, taking a minute, setting boundaries, and not waiting for other people to sign off on your decision. Many survivors of narcissistic abuse, so many survivors, have been gaslighted for so long and infused with a false narrative about themselves. You're the one who is the problem, right? That when people tell you that you're the one with the problem, you start to tend to believe them. If we wait for everyone to sign off on our choices around disengaging a little, setting boundaries, stepping away, then I have to tell you, none of us are ever going to get out of these relationships. You're never going to get full consensus. If you are more discerning, I can promise you, you're probably not going to be popular, but you'll definitely be happier. I'm wondering if this is something you've encountered. You're the one who's being abused, yet you're the one who thinks you're the bad person. I hear this over and over again every day. Dr. Ramani, I feel guilty. From every survivor of a narcissistic relationship. And this is uniquely pronounced in folks who are considering divorce or ending a long-term committed relationship, especially with a person with whom they have children, especially any age, but especially when the children are younger. It absolutely makes sense. The guilt that would come from the idea that you're upending a child's life and changing the structures and rhythms and possibly the home that they've become accustomed to. That idea of I am guilty. When you say that, We feel guilty when you do a bad thing, right? So you feel like you're doing a bad thing. I am doing a bad thing. I had talked with someone who's mulling this over. This person had a really young child. The child was used to the rhythms of two parents. And the things this person kept saying, I feel so guilty, I feel so guilty. I feel so guilty about this decision about potentially wanting to leave. They hadn't done it yet. They were still mulling it over. Their child struggled, with all the stuff that little kids struggle with, separations and all that stuff. And so they didn't want to rock the child's world more by creating more of that, right? So they wanted to wait and wait. I get it. It happens all the time in these relationships that people will opt to wait, maybe for a child to hit a particular transition, start school, graduate from school, turn 18. I fully understand all of that. Most people in committed relationships or marriages with narcissistic folks are basically juggling multiple chainsaws. The abuse of the relationship, the fallout of that abuse, and then trying to be a decent parent to children who, especially when they are young, may still be a big fan of the narcissistic parent. And in most cases, the other parent, the non-narcissistic parent, is doing most of the work of parenting in the household. So under these really imbalanced and pretty dreadful circumstances, there's no perfect time to leave. No matter when you end the relationship with a narcissistic person and you have children together, whether they are very, very young, whether they're already in school, whether they're adolescents, early adulthood, later adulthood, it's always a mess. In essence, if you are going to leave, it's about picking the mess that works for you. But let's go back to that guilt, right? The agonizing that happens for folks in these relationships. People are literally building out spreadsheets, trying to make an impossible decision. But above all that is that sense of guilt. I'm a bad person. I'm wrecking my kids. I'm blowing up a family. I am to blame for this. I'm the one who wants this to end. I'm the one who wants to go. I get it. It is a bad feeling. But the way many survivors of this shape it and frame it is that I'm a bad person about to do something bad that's going to hurt people, especially my children. But that's not really what you're doing, is it? You didn't just wake up one day and decide, hey, I think I'm going to pull the plug on this relationship. I don't want to be married, or I don't want to be with this person anymore. So I think I'm just going to roll the dice on messing with my kids' lives. That's not what you're doing. That's not this. You are being abused. You're being gaslighted, manipulated, ridiculed, yelled at, raged at, silent treatmented. You're being blamed, often doing the lion's share of the emotional and pretty much all the other labor too. And then, again, the caregiving, the logisticking of children and all the practical arrangements. You're being devalued, you're walking on eggshells, and you're a shell of yourself. You've likely tried everything and then some to make it work. You still are. Nothing works other than you completely and utterly capitulating to them like you do if you were in a cult or something. But even that doesn't work unless you also become a mind reader. And even then, because you wouldn't, even if you're a mind reader, you wouldn't be able to control their bad day at work or the traffic on the way home or that their basketball team lost. So as anyone would, you want the abuse to stop, and since it won't stop, it's logical you'd want out, or at least you're considering it as a possibility. You may have higher order wishes out there. Things like you don't want your child to see such a messed up model of marriage or relationships, that you don't want your child to watch you always give in to someone and give in to what is essentially an abusive, tantruming bully in your midst. You worry about that lesson too. It's tough because you know the disruption to routine will hurt them. The other stuff, like seeing such a messed up relationship, those effects may not show themselves until way down the road. Most people who grew up in families where there was a narcissistic parent will say watching such a messed up marriage or relationship messed up their conception of what long-term adult relationships look like. Either way, married or together or not, anyone who had a narcissistic parent will say it took a toll. But the person who is thinking of leaving is the one who feels as though they're the one doing the bad thing. However, in the grand scale of what the bad thing is it abusing someone or is it leaving the abuse? What's the bad thing? You aren't just leaving for the hell of it. You are trying to make a painful decision because you are being harmed. And many people trying to make the decision to leave keep forgetting that part. And forgetting that part is a problem because it means you're not able to fully and realistically see this situation. Because you got some options here, right? Option one is that you stay. Your children endure no change to their schedules and lives and home and all that. I understand that. At some level, it would be easier. But that's not all that you're signing up for. Yeah, your kids are getting to keep their routine. What you're signing up for when you decide to stay is also that you're going to have to keep being in the presence of the narcissistic behavior. And if you are, it means you have to be realistic about it, what it means, what it's going to do to you, and how it's really going to affect your child to see this happening every day. Now, is there a version you stay because it would be easier for your kids? Yep. But that means radical acceptance up to the sky. It means seeing it clearly every single day. It means either you yellow and gray rock through decades and remind yourself about 100 times a day to not blame yourself and not fall for the gaslighting. This is, in essence, a human obstacle course. You're like, okay, don't trip on the gaslight. Don't take the bait. Don't defend. Oops, water trapped. Don't explain. Oof, I got to get over this wall and disengage. Every single damn day is an obstacle course in these relationships. And to do this under conditions of facing chronic contempt or betrayal or dismissiveness and devaluing, it's like having to do that obstacle course in the rain or in 100-degree heat every single day. You are choosing the path of harm and guilt you can live with ultimately. That's it. Either the guilt over upending a child's routine or of staying in something that is taking years off of your life, of keeping two parents around a child every day, but also showing that child a rather unhealthy model of a relationship. These don't feel like choices. But as you weigh out the guilt, remember that you aren't making this decision in a vacuum. You aren't just making a selfish decision to go because it would be better for me. You're also engaged in a response to being harmed. It doesn't make sense that a person being harmed should feel guilty, right? But blaming victims is a way of life in our culture. So we can understand why people feel this way, feel this stuck, feel this guilty in narcissistic relationships. And folks, when I say child, I don't just mean little child. I mean grown adult children who may also not want or like having to split holidays or having their apple cart tumbled or their lives inconvenienced or their inheritances diminished. Many an adult child has bristled at the difficulties raised by their parents' divorce, even though they're grown and out of the house. And now they may not be thrilled that they may also be left to have to deal with the narcissistic parent themselves. Not fun. And you may feel guilty about disrupting the whole world of grandparenting and all the rest of it. None of this ever really gets easier, no matter when you feel you have to make this decision, if you ever feel like you can or want to. But when you feel guilty, take a long look at that. You are responding to an unhealthy situation caused by another person's bad behavior. It's not what you signed up for, but it's what you have. And I actually can't sit here and tell you that one of these paths is better. You can only choose this for yourself, your kids, what works for you. And whatever you do, whenever you do it, keep remembering that you aren't the one who made this relationship into a toxic stew. You are just trying to figure it out in the most compassionate way possible, and that is not easy. Something a lot of people are saying to me is like, oh, now that I understand this, I feel like I'm seeing it everywhere now. So it's not a good feeling, right? But you get it and you're like, okay, I saw it in this person and that person and that person. But do you feel that now that you really kind of understand narcissism, that you feel like you're seeing it in more and more people, situations, news stories? And does that give you pause? may make you wonder, like, come on, everybody can't be narcissistic. So maybe it's a me thing. So let's take on this issue because it's a big one. It's one I'm hearing from more and more folks. Once you really understand what narcissism is as a personality style, and you start seeing it as a pattern, you may start noticing the behavioral pattern or the attitudinal pattern in other people. Folks that you may have been giving a free pass to. He's just a big talker. They don't mean it. Or she had a rough start. Or it's been a tough year for them. That now, in fact, you're seeing it more clearly. And you become aware that actually, that perhaps you came into awareness of narcissism because of one primary relationship that was causing a lot of pain and heartache for you. And then once you got it, really got it, you actually started seeing it in other people that weren't even like, you weren't even taking as much notice of their behaviors. And instead of that feeling like a sense of tremendous liberation, yeah, great, I get it, I see it now, I can honor what I'm seeing and step away. Instead, many folks will say, it can't be all of these people. Maybe I was the problem all along. It's really arrogant of me to think this. So what's the truth? Here's the thing. It's very rare for a person to have just one toxic or narcissistic person in their lives. It tends to be a bit of a clustering effect. And this is really pronounced if it started for you in childhood. There are many issues that come out of growing up in a narcissistic family, but most pointedly, one of the worst issues is that coming from or growing up in a narcissistic family means that you get acculturated to narcissism. You become assimilated to it. Invalidation, gaslighting, manipulation, all of it almost goes unnoticed. Only years later, once it kind of starts burning you out or you encounter it in adulthood and you finally get the narcissism decoder ring, only then are you able to look back maybe more clearly at what your family of origin was about. But this indoctrination means that you don't take note of how toxic these patterns are once you start encountering them in adulthood. That's not to say they feel good, but they may not register as a problem. Selfishness and entitlement might almost feel expected. So when people behave like this, you may not like it, but you may not even notice it. And it may be simply taken as, well, this is how people are. Throw some trauma bonding in there, and the familiar toxic or narcissistic patterns get justified, and the old patterns of being what the other person needs you to be so you can get your attachment needs met ends up in a not very good place. As a result, many unhealthy people may pile up in your life. And then, as you start to learn about narcissism, and especially if you're able to distance from or end relationships with the most problematic narcissistic people in your life, you may find that you have unearthed more unhealthy people, but they may have gone unnoticed for a while in your life. You may have also become quite savvy at picking out the pattern in brand new people in your life. But some of those old patterns, like self-doubt and self-blame, they don't fade easily. So even as your intuition and knowledge are picking up these unhealthy patterns, you may wonder if it's you and whether your sensitivity is too strong. Survivors of narcissistic abuse often remain concerned about their issues with trust. Narcissistic relationships are about betrayal. So as a result, trust gets eroded, and it's really difficult to build it in new relationships. So as time goes on, and you're having more and more difficulty trusting people, you may wonder if you're taking note of different people's behavioral patterns as being narcissistic is actually more about your issues with trust than about an actual issue with their behavior. Probably not. Let's start with the issue that the proliferation of narcissism out there is not a small number of folks. And remember, I can't put too fine a point on this. I am not talking about narcissistic personality disorder. Not. I am talking about people with a sufficient presence of narcissistic traits for their behavior to be a problem. I don't know. Who knows if they meet criteria for the personality disorder? It doesn't matter. My spitball on the number is probably around 20% of folks, maybe a little bit higher in major metropolitan areas like LA or New York or London, but that's 1 in 5. 1 in 5 people. Take account of the number of people you know in your life and divide by 5. You know 20 people, 4 of them may have some really difficult, jagged personalities. And as I think on this, I'm thinking of the people I have the most contact with. A quick straw poll of 10 people I know. I hit 2.5. I'm on the fence about one of them. Give it a try and you're going to see that number of 1 in 5 people who have significant presence of narcissistic personality traits and behaviors. It's about right, right? Now, just as we justified patterns in our narcissistic relationships, convincing ourselves that maybe we are being too critical by thinking about the potential narcissism of people we know or are meeting, maybe that's too judgy. That can mean that we keep sticking around people who aren't good for us until we're convinced. I liken it to one of those haunted houses where you may step up to the scary thing until it makes a noise and then you shriek and jump back. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe we need to stick around long enough for the scary thing to happen. It's not good for us though, right? Someone like me, I tend to overcorrect. I think and deal with narcissism too much in my professional life. So if I experience any of that entitled posturing, non-self-aware, arrogant, snobby stuff, I tend to cut bait pretty fast. That may not be for everyone, but before you talk yourself out of something you're aware and you see the patterns, or wait to see if it was what you actually thought it was, and by actually testing it out or getting scared by it, remember that that might mean that you're still gaslighting yourself. I mean, listen, folks, someone telling you, I don't know, that your favorite TV show sucks when you meet them at a party, or someone who says that they have a different political party affiliation than you, or someone that yammers on about their expensive car all night, even those things may be annoying or they may be off-putting, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're narcissistic. You have to watch someone rather carefully and for a minute to genuinely determine how unhealthy their patterns are in the long term. For example, are they listening to you or anyone else? Do you notice a tone of contempt or dismissiveness in their voice? Are they uncomfortable when the conversation's not about them? Are they snobby? I mean, snobbishness in and of itself may not be narcissism, but let me tell you this, I'm always willing to take the bet on that. I abhor snobbishness, and it is one of those patterns that almost always seems to have narcissism behind it. But those things, those questions to ask yourself when you meet someone, you can learn some of that stuff pretty early on. And remember, narcissism is about process more than it's about content. How the person is rather than exactly what they say. Sometimes that expensive car talking person is just like a little kid who's talking about a new Lego set. But that person may also be willing to hear other people's thoughts and feelings, may not judge other people for not being as car focused as them. They may just be excited about their new car. We tend to get lost in the low-hanging fruit of what people talk about instead of focusing on how they talk about it. So be judicious with this word narcissism. It's overused, so it's losing its meaning. Don't get caught up in trying to find all the narcissistic people in your midst, or trying to figure out if someone is indeed narcissistic 10 minutes after meeting them. But instead focus on whether their behavior feels uncomfortable and invalidating. And if it does, that should be enough of a reason to at least step back, step away, slow down, or get out. So don't doubt yourself. If you are new to the, oh damn, I just recognized my blank is a narcissistic person, and now I'm noticing it in lots of other people, you may just be in the midst of the acute cleanup phase. The best way to figure out if someone's behavior patterns are unhealthy is to take it slow. Pay attention to the how and not just the what. Pay attention to your body. And then you don't need to do an about face and march out if you think someone's narcissistic, but you can slowly disengage. You can watch them from a distance, and recognizing that honoring these new signals within yourself may be a new experience for you. Pay attention. The best way to avoid bringing more narcissistic people into your life or to make the existing narcissistic abuse you are experiencing worse, is to nip it in the bud whenever possible. And maybe these folks are not fully narcissistic per se, but rather there are patterns here that have been a problem in the past in other relationships. You really have to ask yourself, do you really want to do this again? So yeah, it kind of doesn't feel good to feel like, oh, I'm seeing this more and more. The tendency of a lot of folks is to wonder, is this me? Probably not you. It's a little bit more common than a lot of us dreamed. And there's, again, you don't have to do the about face. You can slow it down, pay attention. But as the signs pile up, by taking it slow, hopefully you haven't engaged so much that when you do step away, there's minimal muss and fuss. Thanks again.